Today, rocketing bills, illegal loan sharks and, of course, Prime Minister's questions at noon. This is Politics Live. Joining me today, Conservative MP Bob Seeley, Labour MP Stella Creasy, Kate Ferguson from The Sun on Sunday, and Jack McKenna, who's a former advisor to Angela Rayner. On the programme today, the Chancellor summons industry regulators to number 11. Can he push back the tide of rising prices?
They are in no state at the moment to achieve those ends, and it is just not true to say they will.
A former Conservative minister, John Gummer, says the UK won't meet its net zero targets.
I'm not texting you. I'm not following you. I am outside your house.
Is the cost of living crisis pushing people into the hands of illegal loan sharks?
When something like this happens to you, you know that it happens to you because you were there, you felt it, you felt amazed, shocked and rather humiliated.
The TV producer who says she was groped in Downing Street lodges a complaint. The man she accuses denies it ever happened. All that and Prime Minister's questions at noon. We'll bring you that live. And we start today with the price of the water in your taps. Let's look at this headline from The Times this morning. You can see it there. Water bills will rise by up to 40% amid crisis. Spills and climate change need cash, say bosses. This is the report in The Times today that prices are due to rise. It's going to be announced next year, The Times says, could result in annual bills increasing from an average of about £450 a year to £680 plus inflation in some parts of the country. So quite eye-watering there, pardon the pun. Bob, is it right that consumers should be picking up the tab for mending the water system, mending these problems with the sewage system?
Well, the companies have a responsibility to improve our environment. And last year, or 2 years ago, when we brought in the Environment Bill, we recognised that we needed to clean up our sewage system, we needed to clean up our rivers, beaches and seas. So that is a really important thing that we're doing. But look, there's a great contrast here with what we're trying to do and what the Labour Party is promising. We recognise that we need to improve the environment, but it's really important, especially in the era that we live in with rising bills, that we do so in a way that's affordable. So therefore, discussions about nationalising assets or digging up the entire sewage network, both of which would cost in excess of 100 billion, are unaffordable. What we are trying to do, Elizabeth, is trying to find a balance, being responsible about the environment because people want environmental improvements, but doing it in a way that doesn't cost the earth. What we're doing with these bills, as we're trying to do with the mortgage stuff last week, was to make sure that the big players in the banks and the water firms are giving people a fair deal because people want a government that is on their side.
So who should be paying then? Who should be paying? Well,
in the immediate term, the increase in bills is because borrowing is costing more. And so the companies are borrowing. The money's got to come from somewhere, Elizabeth. So you either put up taxes.
That's completely ridiculous.
You either put up taxes or you put up the bill. So what we're doing...
No, you don't.
Okay,
no,
Jack,
you don't. The water companies are borrowing to pay dividends. They've paid £50 billion in dividends since 1991. And last year they made £3 billion of profits. So they don't need to borrow. Chief executives are getting paid £3 million a year. You're saying, oh, it's unaffordable. That's unaffordable.
Jack,
they're pumping sewage.
You've interrupted. Let me answer.
I didn't interrupt, but you were making a completely absurd point. So I said that needs some rebuttal.
I'm not making absurd
You were making absurd points about the Labour Party's proposals. It is affordable. It is affordable. £2.8 billion profit last year. It's a cost of living crisis. Every single bill is going up. Every single person's pay is going down.
OK, let's let Bob come back to that.
Rivers, and they should be the ones that pay.
When the companies were nationalised, they invested £500 million a year. In the first period of privatisation, they invested £1 billion. Now, under the latest plans, they're investing £2 billion a year. So they're investing in our system 4 times the amount. But look, if you want to nationalise the utilities, just say so and tell us how much it's going to cost and tell us who is going to pay.
Stella.
Completely
Bob, one of the numbers you've just missed
politics.
out on there is how much they've also been paying to their shareholders, which is £1.4 billion just last year. And what it looks like is these companies have been borrowing money to pay their shareholders because interest rates have been low. And now we're all going to be left with the bill for it, because there are some companies, because they represent vital services, that we can't allow to go bust. And I live in London. We looks like Thames Water is about to be in that position
So what's your
entirely.
plan, Stella?
Actually, I want to be much more radical.
What's your plan?
Than nationalisation. I don't think nationalisation is the answer. I think mutualisation is the answer. I'd like to see customers represented on the board, so that actually these companies have to start making decisions in the public interest. Because I think we can both agree that deciding to pay your shareholders and failing to invest in your infrastructure so that leaks are at an all-time high is not in the public interest.
Sorry,
and that's what
not
you
true.
presided over. Bob,
Stella,
with the
that's not
greatest
true.
will, I sat and I listened very carefully to what you said. I hope you will pay me the same respect. It's very clear here that because these companies are private companies, they've put their shareholders before the British public. We are all going to end up paying the price. But it's a bit like the banks. I mean, we heard the Chancellor saying, oh, I brought all the banks in. He's got very few tools to actually get the banks to change. And we're seeing the banks not passing on to the savers the money they're making from the higher rates they're charging for mortgages. I think all of us recognise that our constituents cannot afford these bills. None of us want to see climate change paying the price for it, because we know we've got a climate emergency. These water companies, like the banks, are making profits out of this situation. It's about time they showed some responsibility and contributed to that.
Kate,
That's the difference between us, Bob.
Kate, where are your readers on this, do you think?
Well, my readers will be pretty shocked today at reports that bills are going to rocket by up to 40%. Obviously, it's a huge cost of living crunch, the worst we've seen in generations. And that is the kind of bill rise that many just cannot afford to make. So they will be alarmed that people like the bosses at Thames Water are being paid £1.4 million.
That was the dividends. The shareholders in dividends in 2022 got 1.4 billion. That's according to Financial Times analysis. And the CEO, James Bentley...
got money on top of that?
Yes. Yeah.
So, you know, my readers will be alarmed that there's huge profiteering. Meanwhile, their bills are going up and the service isn't very good. I do think that's probably why the government are getting them in to kind of bash heads together to see if there is a way, probably falling short of nationalisation or mutualisation, I would have thought, in which they can actually try and kind of manage this situation so bills aren't rocketing to kind of for ratepayers at a time when they can't afford it.
Mutualisation isn't the same as nationalisation, because nationalisation...
Do you want to explain what it is, Stella? What do you mean?
Requiring these companies, for example, to have customer representatives on the board. That wouldn't cost us anything, but it would start to mean they'd have to listen, and customers would be directly involved in making those decisions.
Stella,
Where we have seen
listen.
not-for-profit companies... Well, I'm sorry, they haven't, because otherwise we wouldn't be in a position...
because we're telling them, we're instructing them what to do.
And how's that working out, Bob? Because we're looking at bills going up, not down.
We've quadrupled our investment into the water system, into this country. We've quadrupled our investment.
When you look at those companies that are not private companies, the national companies, those that are run not for profit, it is a very different scenario.
In Wales,
so let's be clear that mutualisation isn't actually the same as nationalisation. It doesn't come with the same price tag that you are talking about.
in Wales,
but it would mean that there would actually be a direct lever on these companies. And as we've seen with the banks and as we've seen with the water companies, this government is afraid to actually get stuck in and speak up for consumers. We need somebody in the room to do that. And it's a Labour government and it's people on the board.
Is that Labour policy now, Stella, the mutualisation?
Oh, it's policy of the Co-op Party, and I'm a Labour and cooperative MP.
Well,
I just want to bring Jack back in here, because he was the one who first mentioned nationalisation. Jack...
I didn't mention nationalisation. Bob mentioned nationalisation.
Okay, forgive me.
All he's got to say, all he's got to say is throwing something at somebody else. The Conservatives are apparently a free market party, right? You all like free markets. The water market is not a free market. It's a racket, right? If you don't like what your water company is doing, you can't turn your tap on and use a different supplier. It's an oligopoly. They're all hiking prices. They're all paying massive dividends. They're all paying massive salaries to their CEOs. It would be fine if you could move to a different supplier. There could be a competitor. They're charging less for their water and they're not pumping sewage into the water. Great, but you can't. You're stuck with your supplier. So it makes no sense to be defended on free market grounds. It isn't a free market. The Conservative Party are in the wrong place on it.
But
and
Jack,
the voters are going to give them a kicking because it makes no sense.
In the past, we had heard from Keir Starmer had kind of floated the idea of renationalising water. It looks very much as though the party is not going to do that now. Rachel Reeves, the Shadow Chancellor last year, saying to be spending billions of pounds on nationalising things that just doesn't stack up against our fiscal rules. So the party isn't going to renationalise water. Are you very disappointed by that?
It's not that I'm disappointed about it because I think that something needs to be done urgently.
Well, the idea of mutualisation is that...
The idea about nationalisation is I think they'll be very worried that these companies would take them to court, and it would be very costly, and it would take a very long time, and it would be expensive in terms of the assets, etc., etc. We've all rehashed the arguments. The point is, the Chancellor is going to do nothing today about those bills. The regulator, the chief executive of the regulator, is more interested in defending the industry. It's a captured regulator. They're not doing anything about these bills. They're not doing anything about these discharges. It's a scandal. It's a scandal.
You mentioned regulators. Interestingly enough, let's look at this headline in the Financial Times this morning. Jeremy Hunt to discuss cost of living with regulators. Jeremy Hunt actually had the regulators in number 11 this morning.
And how many of the regulators used to work for the industry, and how many of the industry used to work for the regulator? It's a little revolving door. It's a very cushy little club. They're not going to get serious about this issue. And £3 billion profits last year in the middle of a cost of living crisis, putting people's bills up £200. That is just a racket.
Bob, the Chancellor is ostensibly meeting with these regulators to say, look, we really need to try and take care of people. We've got to try and hold people's bills down. What should he be saying to them? You know, what levers should he be pulling to try and influence the regulators to perhaps take a harder line?
Again, we need to be finding a balance. We need to be making sure that there's pressure to keep down people's bills because, A, there's a cost of living crisis, but that's why our £94 billion package was £3,300 per household. But at the same time, we have a responsibility to try to clean up the environment. And what we're trying to do is to do that in a way that is affordable. And when it comes to the companies, look, they are controlled by law. They're regulated monopolies. To say they can do what they like is simply untrue. They are regulated monopolies who act within the law, and the Environment Bill from 2 years ago has regulated much higher standards. They need to get that investment from somewhere. They have quadrupled rates of investment compared to when they were nationalised, so we get a better water system, but it is at a price that we can afford. OK, all right, well, you mentioned the environment. Let's have a look at the front of The Guardian now. UK has made no progress on climate plans, says government's own advisers. This is the news that the Climate Change Committee has said that its confidence in the UK meeting its goals from 2030 onwards are now markedly less than they were a year ago. A key opportunity to push faster pace of progress has been missed. That, according to Lord Devon, formerly known, of course, as John Gummer, the chair of the Climate Change Committee. Let's have a listen to what he said on this.
2030 and 2035 are the two dates the government chose to set these targets when they had the very successful Glasgow summit. And the awful thing is that they have missed out on all they did in the Glasgow summit. They've missed out on what could have been done for cheap renewable energy during this awful cost of living crisis and the energy crisis, and they've failed to do the things that they said they would do, and that's why we've had to be very tough about it.
Lord Devon there. Bob, is the UK just missing the boat on climate change now? I'm
going to take a slightly different point of view, and I think it's really important that we look after our environment well, that we push towards a much greener world, that we try to stick to these net zero targets. But we have to do it in a way that is, frankly, commonsensical, because I think we are in danger of actually damaging ourselves. If you have a growing economy, it is much easier to make those changes. Let me give you two reasons why I get really frustrated with the Climate Committee, and both of them are to do with a sort of bureaucratic mindset. Firstly, we're shutting down, rightly, coal-fired power stations, and we're using gas as a transition. We have the biggest offshore wind market now in the world. We're a world leader in it, OK? So we're really pushing forward with renewables. But we've shut down our coal. If we now get electricity from Holland or Germany, electricity supply, it's technically green because it comes from abroad, despite the fact that Holland has 5 coal-fired power stations, and the Germans, because of the absolute idiocy of shutting down nuclear power, are relying on 34 coal-fired power stations to keep them going. It is daft, bureaucratically and in common sense terms, that we are importing electricity from other countries. One other point. Half our carbon reduction, which is, reducing our carbon is great. Half our reduction is because we export our manufacturers to places like China. Every 3 weeks or so, China is building a new coal-fired power station to build the stuff that we no longer build in this country and then exporting it back to us. Again, that is simply crazy. We need to be insuring this stuff and trying to find ways of making goods here, but actually less environmental damage, because we're technically becoming cleaner ourselves whilst making the globe a dirtier place. And this is just this sort of, some of the politics of climate change are really just, I think, Kate, your readers would say they completely lack common sense. It's just crazy.
Yeah, a lot of
we
it
need
is
to be much more
congruent.
realistic.
Yeah. Look, my readers are very straightforward about this. Do they think climate change is happening? Yes. Would they like it tackled? Yes.
Yes.
They do not want to be hammered with rocketing bills, with arbitrary dates for banning things they own, just to hit targets, which seem very impractical.
And not building roads. I'm sorry, if we're going to have battery powered cars in 20 years, why are we not building roads? It's just nonsense.
Stella.
But it isn't. It's a false choice that you're making. Let me give you a good example from my local community, where there is a whole street of people who have just raised the money, and they're working with Octopus Energy to put solar panels on the entire street. So they're all now going to save money on their bills because they're using solar energy power.
Great.
One of the frustrations that I have with
I'm not against. My readers aren't against that.
It's not an either-or, Stella.
Okay, stop, because I've listened to you, Bob.
Crack on.
You're putting. Oh, thank you so much. You're positing that it's an either-or, and again, I just hear Conservative MPs time and time again, long on analysis, short on answers. The question for us is, how do you get that investment? How do you fast-track it? So how do you make sure that what's happening in Walthamstow can happen in streets across the country? Because we have one of the highest levels of child poverty in the country in my local community. For those families, the savings they'll make on those energy bills are absolutely critical, and that is what investment makes a difference. So it's not actually about either or. The challenge with these debates, and I think what's so powerful about that report, is it's saying the government set its own targets, it's going to miss them, and as a result we're all going to end up paying more. So we're going to pay more in the environmental terms and in economic terms too. I've just spent this morning with the steel industry, who are going out of their mind looking for some leadership from this government about clean steel and about the environmental transition we need, so that we can keep building things, but we're not building carbon into the economy. There is no leadership on that bill, and it's a bit like the leadership on the water companies, on the energy companies. You can say you want a common sense approach, but you can't actually set out what that is. And in the meantime, people's bills are going up, the carbon is going up, and everybody's saying, well, hang on a minute, you said you were going to do this, and you can't give any answers.
But Stella, is that not Labour's argument in terms of delaying? You know, you've now said you're going to delay the £28 billion green investment plan when you get into that. Is that not a pragmatic decision?
It's a decision based on the fact of whether you can spend at that level straight off from government. So, you know, I hope we will get a Labour government when the next election is. Your ability to invest, I mean, like I say, if you're going to put solar panels on people's houses, it does take a bit of organisation. You can't do it straight away. To make that commitment and say, actually, investing in these energy saving measures will help us with the environment and with the economy is the smart thing to do. But it's not happening. I mean, if anything, you're going backwards.
I'm sorry.
Your own independent report says you're going backwards. You can have an argument about the timing of the target, but the detail in that report is really, really damning about the government's failure to focus on it. A bit like inflation, a bit like waiting lists. Everything is falling apart, but you want to talk about the boats.
3 months ago, we had, for the first time, we are now producing less carbon emissions than we were in 1850. For the first time now, you have renewables, especially when it's windy, especially in summer, producing more than 50% of our electricity needs.
So why aren't you going to meet your target, then?
Do not pretend.
Why aren't you going to meet your target then?
Because
if you can do this, why aren't you going to meet your target?
I think net zero was an arbitrary target, and I think we have to look at whether we can achieve those targets.
Based on science.
But to say no progress has been made,
no
progress has been made is simply not true.
We're living through hotter and hotter summers, colder and colder winters. People are paying the price of it, and you're saying science doesn't matter.
The price because electricity bills, so much of paying for renewables is in the green surcharges on electricity bills.
Jack, do you think this has somewhat fallen down the agenda for a lot of normal people, given the cost of living crisis? I mean, do you hear people talking about this as much?
I think that's missed the point. Let me tell you, outside London, I live in Manchester. If I was to get the train in order to be here on time for this interview, it would have cost £369.40 return to get from the second city to the capital.
I live in Birmingham, Jack. I would dispute the fact that Manchester's the second city, but there you go.
That's for another time. There's a flight leaving London Gatwick in about 45 minutes to New York, £365. So it's cheaper to fly across the Atlantic than it is to get from Manchester to London for work. So to say this is not about the cost of living, it completely is. If you're trying to get across the north, you cannot get there on the train. TransPennine cancels, pretty much more than it runs. You have to have a car. You get to Manchester Piccadilly, the main transit, site in Manchester. There's taxis, there's car parks, there's no bikes. Massive story in the north. There's no schemes like in London for bikes. Bob's government and Bob...
You've got a Labour mayor sorted. You've got a Labour mayor. Take responsibility.
That is...
Come on, you've got a Labour mayor. Take responsibility.
Please let me finish. Please let me finish. The active travel budget that you and your government cut in Manchester, in my city, is £1 per person per year. How many bikes does that buy you, Bob? Not very many, about 0.03.
You have a Labour mayor, take responsibility, get him to
take responsibility for the swinging austerity over the last 30... No, Bob, we're talking about interest rates, talking about the cost of living. The last 13 years would have been a perfect time to invest in green transport. That would have helped us with our emissions, helped us with net zero, and helped people with affordable travel. But the government hasn't done any of that. It hasn't used any of the levers at its disposal. It's just washed its hands.
We've been investing hundreds of millions in cycle routes, and we see them all over the country.
You've cut the budgets in half. You've cut the budgets in half at the spending review 3 months ago. That's just absurd.
3 months ago.
What about bus regulation?
Kate,
1,000 buses.
Buses is a great
hang
example.
on, Boris, hang on. Go ahead.
Okay, Kate, is this something that your readers are passionate about?
My readers are worried that they're being clobbered with higher prices as a cost for net zero policies. So look, it's all very well and good setting targets, and when you set them, I'm sure you feel pretty good about it when you have a conference. The point is, are they achievable? How are you going to achieve it? Who's going to bear the burden for them? If you're going to scrap all kind of hybrid cars by, I think it's 2035, is it? You know, who's going to pay the price for those electric cars that cost a lot more money? You talked about the fact that lots of people are still reliant on cars. I don't have the percentage on the tip of my tongue, but you leave big city centres and everyone's reliant on their car to get around. That's life. You've got to be realistic about it. And this is not going to be the top priority when people are struggling with their bills, with their mortgages, with inflation. It doesn't mean that you shouldn't do anything. And by the way, I would say something before everyone has a go at me, is I think my newspaper is the only paper that is always very pro-building stuff and anti-NIMBY and pro-wind farms and things. So it's not that we're not saying you can't do anything, it's that you've got to be realistic about if arbitrary bans are the way to go.
Right, OK, very good. We are going to leave that there and move on now and talk about illegal loan sharks. There's a report out today which says the decline of legal high street moneylenders, so that's companies like Wonga, has pushed people towards illegal lenders. There's an event in Parliament talking about this today, and the BBC has also spoken to 2 illegal loan sharks on the condition of anonymity. They spoke to BBC Newsnight. Let's hear what they had to say.
Replace your vehicle, replace your windows, your door, broken nose, smashed up eye sockets. They're going to wish they paid me. They get a chance to explain themselves. Usually it's once or twice, and that's it. I'm not texting you. I'm not following you. I am outside your house. And you don't want me outside your house.
Once you punch someone or bully them, the threat's no good. It's better to have that fear, that intimidation or that coercion. Maybe someone will go and knock on your neighbour's door and their conversation will go like, oh, is he okay? Because he's borrowed some money off of me and all of a sudden I can't get in touch with him.
OK, that was 2 illegal moneylenders there speaking to BBC Newsnight. Pretty disturbing it is. Let's speak now. I think joining us down the line, we have the CEO of the non-profit that wrote that report, Sasha Romanovich. So, Sasha, is there a direct link then, in your view, between the sort of collapse, the demise of the payday loan lenders, the legal ones, and the kind of an uptick in illegal loan sharks?
I think how I'd put it is we've got a bit of a perfect storm in that we've got the cost of living crisis, which is increasing people's need to access small amounts of affordable credit to smooth things over, alongside a much needed clamp down on egregious behaviours by lenders. But actually what that's done is it made it unprofitable for a lot of lenders to be in the marketplace, and so they've withdrawn. So we've now got a really big gap. We estimate it's about a £3 billion gap in provision. And whilst we've got credit unions and community finance providers who are doing a great job, people don't know enough about them. And unfortunately, illegal money lenders are trying to step in to swoop up the market.
And why have those legal money lenders, the Wongas of this world, withdrawn from the market?
Well, a lot of them were regulated out for very good reasons. There's now regulation which puts in an interest rate cap. So if you borrow £100, you can't pay more than £100 in interest on that loan. That organisations have to do quite a lot of checks to make sure that you can afford to take a loan and that that's appropriate for you. And also a mechanism whereby, if you're found to have been lent to unfairly, then you can go back through the Ombudsman to get your money back. What all of that's done is it just means that for an organisation to lend a £200 loan, that means there's an awful lot of additional cost that goes with it. And so what you found is that a lot of mainstream providers have gone what we call upmarket, because the costs of a £5,000 loan are the same as probably doing a £200 loan, but there's not as much profit in the £200 loan.
Okay, all right, stick with us, Sasha. I just want to ask the panel about this. Stella, you were heavily involved in campaigning on the regulation of those payday loan lenders. This sort of seems like an unintended consequence. That is
No. Let's be very clear. She's just said that people were being lent large amounts of money without any checking about whether they could afford it, without any of the consequences of what would happen if they did borrow from it. I would also dispute the idea that people have left the market, because we're seeing, for example, other forms of legal loan sharking. So it's not just because payday lending isn't as prevalent in the advertising, it still exists, but it exists at a more affordable rate. The buy now, pay later lenders have filled the gap. In the last year alone, 8 million people were borrowing from buy now, pay laters in 2021. It's now 17 million people, and that is completely unregulated. So for those of us who are desperately concerned about all those people with too much month at the end of their money, this is a story about the failure to invest in, say, trading standards, to be able to tackle the illegal lenders, the failure on the government's commitments to support the credit union industry to grow, to fill that gap, to have affordable credit.
I was just about to say...
And the failure to regulate all the other forms of legal loan sharking. That means that our constituents are drowning in debt and being targeted by these people. Because the worst thing of all about the situation now is I would actually encourage people to go to a payday lender rather than use their credit card or rather than use a buy now, pay later lender, because at least there is a point at which the debt stops. It's not an interest rate cap, it's a cap on the cost of credit. Basically, there's a point at which you can't get into any more debt. There is no other form of credit in this country in that position. And that is why those millions of people drowning in buy now, pay later debt that the government know about, know it's the same problem as Wonga in the making, know that the regulators aren't on top of it, know that they need to regulate. It's disgraceful because it will be another big scandal.
Sasha, is Stella right on those points?
I think, there are some very valid points in there that, buy now, pay later, we think does need to be regulated. However, even when you take that into account, there is actually a really big gap in people providing credit to people that we call are in financially vulnerable circumstances at a fair and affordable rate. And I think there are two things that we're really trying to get out. One is awareness of credit unions and community finance providers is really low. For those who could use them, it's about 5% awareness. So getting the shout out to them, because they don't have the big marketing budgets that buy now, pay later or a Wonga had. And then the other side is that we do need to have some structural reform so that people can access through a regulated market fair and affordable credit for their needs. So I think that those go alongside the things that Stella's talked about as being really important.
OK, Bob.
OK, I pay tribute to the work that Stella's done on this. Well done. I think it's really important.
Oh, thank you.
OK. And thank you very much indeed to Sasha as well. Look, I would make 2 points. We have regulated this market and we've had tried to answer the concerns that people have had. And so what we've had is we've had a growth in a legal regulated market. But unfortunately, that's pushed some people into these sort of thuggish and vile lenders, which is obviously what we don't want to see. So clearly there is a role for doing much more with the credit unions. And I'm very happy to support that and work with government on that and see if we can make that happen. But secondly, just when it comes to the household bills, the whole point about the household bills crisis at the moment is that's why we've got the windfall tax, and the windfall tax has given 30 billion plus to the 94 billion that's gone to support households over the last year, just over the last year, and that's worked out as an average of about £3,300 per household. So clearly we know that there is a cost of living crisis. That's why we've had the windfall tax. That's why we're spending 100 billion, near 100 billion on this. But if there's more that needs to be done for the credit to highlight the work of credit unions, etc., then we should be doing that.
OK, Jack, do you want to come in here?
Yeah, I just think this whole debate shows sort of how out of touch Westminster is with the rest of the country, talking about regulation, talking about little changes around. The bottom line is people are skint because their pay doesn't pay enough to pay the rent, pay the bills, pay the childcare, pay whatever it is. And so we can talk about fiddling around the edges, but ultimately, we're not talking about people who are out of work here, are we?
Not necessarily, no one.
Not necessarily, that's my point. The labour market is quite tight. We're not looking at huge numbers of unemployed people. What we're talking about here is in-work poverty. We're talking about people that are working for their poverty in one of the richest economies in the world. That's the big issue here. It's not about making tweaks around the edges.
Sorry, Jack, I'm going to have to pick you up on that. The regulation makes a massive difference. What we saw with Wonga was millions of people stuck in an unaffordable debt trap because of the failure to regulate. The failure to regulate the buy now, pay laters. It's been going on for years now. For years, I've been pleading personally with the Treasury ministers to learn the lessons of Wonga. It's not small beer when you've got people who absolutely, their wages don't meet their needs, and these companies are directly profiteering off that and encouraging people to get into further debt, because it's not about repaying the loan, it's about repaying some of it and being stuck in a trap with these people. This is not a small beer fiddling issue. It's the failure of the government to deal with that. It's such a big issue because you could see the problem coming. You could argue with Wonga they didn't realise how big it was going to be. We can see how big buy now, pay latering is going to be. And I asked them again this week what they're doing. They've been sitting on the regulation proposals for months, if not years now, and failing to act. And you have to ask yourself why that is, because they've had lots of cosy meetings with the industry and they're not listening to the consumers who are drowning in this debt.
And let me just come back. Stella, I'm not dismissing the commendable work that you've done on this issue, nor the importance of regulation. What I'm saying is if we actually want to tackle the root causes that drives people towards...
I agree, but a rip-off is a rip-off is a rip-off, and this credit is a form of a rip-off.
Of course it is. I think we're on the same side on this issue. I'm just saying from Bob's perspective, the government has been in power for 13 years, in which we've seen real pay flatline and bills going through the roof. We haven't built social housing. There's people in the private rented sector. We've not given people a pay rise through a massive cost of living crisis and a pandemic. Of course, there's going to be people that are skint at the end of the month, and I think we also need to talk about tackling in-work poverty as well as regulating the people that find them vulnerable and lend to them.
Kate.
Well, I mean, I think this seems like a very alarming report. Two thuggish loan sharks there talking about how they're exploiting people's poverty. I mean, I don't think there's that much disagreement here. This is something that should be regulated. Clearly, there's a problem in the market where people at the lower level who need to, who in times of dire straits need a bit of money are struggling to find a kosher, good lender who will not exploit their vulnerability. And clearly more needs to be done, either working with banks or co-ops or whatever, in terms of making sure you get that kind of small lending market working so that these people do have that help.
OK. Sasha, you still with us? Yeah, you have a meeting today on this, don't you? What are you hoping to achieve?
I think the key things that we're wanting to do is, one is get really cross-party consensus that getting a functioning market that works in the future, that serves people who the market may not think are profitable to serve, is really important. And there are some great international examples of countries that have mechanisms to do that. So, for example, the US makes banks put investment into this area so people can get what they need. The second thing is really sort of thinking about what lenders can do right now to help people. So, for example, we're funding credit unions and community finance providers to build benefits calculators into their check, because actually sometimes people don't need to borrow. There are £15 billion worth of unclaimed benefits. And I think the third thing is just keep raising awareness of credit unions and community finance providers. We, with support from the Dormant Asset Scheme, have been able to put a lot of money into helping them grow. One of the biggest opportunities is actually people turning to them rather than to legal money lenders.
OK, thank you, Sasha. Very quickly, Bob, if you will. You want
Sasha,
to come in.
is there more powers that you give to the credit unions, or do you think they have enough power at the moment? Is she still there? I don't know if she's...
She is. I think she's still there. She can hear us.
Sasha, you're still there?
Sasha, are you there?
I think there's some really good stuff coming through in the Financial Services and Markets Bill, which is actually giving credit unions the ability to offer more products, which then just lets them get to be more sustainable as a business. So I think that there is that in train. And I think the more we can talk about it, and also anyone sitting there thinking, I'm going to help a credit union, I'm going to save with them. Actually, the most helpful thing you can probably do right now is borrow from them, because that enables them to spread their risk and to work with customers who maybe are seen as a bit more risky on the spectrum.
Some of the answers that we're going to see are going to come in this bill that we're bringing in, the Financial Services Market Bill, yes?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay,
Very
there you
much.
go. I think Bob got the answer he wanted there. Sasha Romanovic, thank you very much for joining us. We really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thanks. We're going to move on now. Prime Minister's questions in about 10 minutes' time. So before that, we are going to carry it. We can see the house. There you go, there. Filling up. Well, it doesn't look so full there, does it? But it is filling up. You can see on the wide shot. But before that, so we've got a little bit of time to talk about a few other stories. We're going to turn now to something we did discuss briefly yesterday. It's an accusation of inappropriate behaviour, of groping, by the Conservative candidate for London Mayor, Daniel Korski. This accusation was made by the novelist and TV producer Daisy Goodwin. She's accused Mr. Gorski of groping her inappropriately in 2013 during a meeting at Downing Street. Let's hear a clip of her speaking this morning on the Today programme.
Yes, it happened to me 10 years ago, but when something like this happens to you, you know that it happens to you because you were there, you felt it, you felt amazed, shocked, and rather humiliated.
Daisy Goodwin there, and we can hear now from Dan Korski when he was speaking on Talk TV last night. He categorically denies those accusations.
I didn't do what's been alleged. I absolutely didn't do that. 10 years ago when it happened, nothing was said to me. 7 years ago when this first came out, nobody alleged anything to me. I just didn't do what's being alleged.
OK, that was Mr. Gorski there. I should say he has said in a statement that he would welcome an investigation should there be one. What should there be an investigation, Bob?
Elizabeth, sorry, I don't know the case. I hope he hasn't done this. If he has, he's got to fess up and explain what happened. I have actually met Daisy, so I've got a lot of respect for Daisy Goodwin. I'm sure she's would have no reason for not saying the truth. So, but look, I'm not.
On that basis, there should be an investigation then?
Look, if there needs to be one, there needs to be one. I'm not really comfortable talking about individual...
Does there need to be one?
I'm not going to talk about individual cases because I wasn't there and I don't know, OK? What I'm saying is that both sides, everyone in politics should try to adhere to high standards. That includes everyone on our side and that includes everyone at your side. Because we see from time to time that people on my side are getting done for things that they shouldn't do, inappropriate behaviour. Likewise, we've had Labour MPs suspended quite recently for potentially the same thing. Both sides need to keep their houses in order. The one thing I would say that I don't think it's very sensible when we just throw mud at each other to try to make political gain out of this. So we should demand high standards from us and Labour should demand high standards from their side as well.
Stella?
I'm not sure that means that you think an investigation should take place, Bob, because ultimately in all of this, I agree with you. As somebody
probably.
who has...
I mean, my gut feeling is probably, but
right.
Look,
so
I don't
the question
know.
is, why hasn't it? Because this allegation has come forward. Ms Goodwin, I've not met Ms Goodwin, I've not met Dan Korski, but she's named the person that she's made the allegation towards. The right thing now to do would be to have an investigation. One of the things that many of us have done is to challenge our own political parties to have in place an independent process where people can feel they can come forward, because it is really difficult to come forward about somebody in a position of power. And when Mr Korski says, well, you know, this was 10 years ago, he's not recognising that to come forward and say somebody who was in Downing Street did this to you in Downing Street, of all places.
That's really, OK. I think it's really interesting you say that. So if we're talking about historic stuff, did you read the Financial Times piece about Peter Mandelson when he was allegedly staying with Jeffrey Epstein when Epstein was in prison for soliciting prostitution from a minor?
I'm sorry, I haven't read
Nobody's
that.
accusing Mandelson of doing anything illegal.
Right.
There was a very big piece in the Financial Times about this.
Bob, and said,
do you think that is appropriate or inappropriate?
Bob, you've just sat there and said, let's not politicise this, not throw mud. I'm saying all political parties need in place a process. When a disclosure is made, a disclosure has been made, a complaint has come forward, it needs to be investigated because it's the only way.
Did you read the piece in the Financial Times?
Let's not start speculating on another story which we don't have information on. Mr Mandelson isn't here to defend himself.
I
think both sides need to keep
all right, we're going to move on from this. Just to reiterate, Mr Korski, who is in the running to become Conservative candidate for mayor, has denied Ms Goodwin's allegations and has said he would welcome an investigation.
Not for any of us to
and he would cooperate fully.
Speculate. The point is to have an investigation to find out what happened.
Exactly. There's one point that's been missed there, though. that when I've been on the phone.
Let's no. Let's move on. We're gonna.
No, the Conservative Party said it wasn't a matter for them yesterday. I'm pleased that they've now said that. I think it is after.
Well, an official complaint has been made to the Cabinet Office now, but we are going to leave that there and we're going to move on. Actually, Jack, you might be able to tell us a bit more about this. There's a story in the Telegraph last night saying that Keir Starmer, we can expect a reshuffle of his top cabinet. You, of course, used to work for Angela Rayner. She's been in the spotlight quite a lot, and her and the leader don't always appear to see eye to eye. Do you expect her role to change if there is a reshuffle?
I'm not sure what you're referring to about reshuffles in Keir and Angela. I think it's quite a clever tool to brief out a reshuffle. It happens every few months and it does keep people working hard. It does keep people focused on the task in hand. So there is one point about briefing newspapers about reshuffles. I think one of the interesting points
Have you briefed newspapers about reshuffle?
I haven't.
You sounded like a person who spoke from experience there, Jack.
It's interesting for a leader to suggest that there might be a reshuffle because it focuses the minds, let's say.
Well, we don't know where that line has come from.
We don't, but it probably would focus the minds of the shadow ministers. I think that the interesting point is that because there's been so many shufflings of the deck chairs of the Titanic in Sunak's cabinet, the Labour Party shadow cabinet doesn't match up.
You think it looks too stable?
No, there's government departments that aren't directly shadowed, and there's likewise Labour shadow ministers, and we don't know how that's going to look in government. So I think at some point between now and the next election,
there probably will be.
Keir Starmer will set out how that's going to work.
Starmer briefing against each other is untrue, is it?
I can't speak.
I read it all the time in the papers. They brief against each other. Is it true or not?
Not as far as I'm aware, but you'd probably have to ask.
I tell you what, Stella, you tell us. What's the relationship like?
I really don't think you have a leg to stand on about people in your political party briefing newspapers. I do think Jack is right. I think most of us expect, just simply because there are new government departments, so it doesn't quite match up who's shadowing what, not least because we've all been asking, well, who's covering which element. So I think it is inevitable there will be. But
on that particular point of the leader and the deputy leader not getting on, what is their relationship like?
Oh, come on. This is the psychodramas that people want to put up. I sit in a meeting every week. I'm a mere backbencher, and I sit in a backbench meeting every week, and I see the good humour between Angela and Keir. All right, so I just see it firsthand. I see they get on. I see they argue about things. That's healthy, but I think that they get on with each other, and I see it firsthand. If I didn't see that, I'd be worried, because as I see from the Conservative Party, which is all over the shop, and you see people squaring up to each other. I've seen you all squaring up.
The Prime Minister has a plan. You don't.
Okay.
You give up policy. You've had more.
Bob, you've basically become a Twitter troll today.
More relaunches.
Listen to other people. All right.
Bob, there's loads of by-elections because you're all trying to get a job in the House of Lords. Come on.
Okay.
Literally, Nadine Dorries, is she going to resign or not? Before we get on to whether you think Angela and Keir get on with each other, all I can speak to is my own experience of watching them and the camaraderie between them in those meetings, and I have to sit there every week. So.
That's your first-hand experience. Just very quickly, because we've got a couple of minutes, we think, before we go into PMQs, let's take a look at this headline in the Telegraph. There it is. It is, "We need credible force to be a deterrent," says head of British Army. This article raising concerns raised by the Joint Chief, well, we don't call it that in this country, do we, Bob? You're a military man. The Chief of the General Staff.
Chief of the Defence Staff.
Chief of the Defence Staff.
Sorry, General Staff.
Concerns that the British Army now is below 200,000 at its lowest level.
That's the Armed Forces as a whole.
The Armed Forces as a whole, and raising very big concerns about it in light of a world where we have Ukraine, Russia, China. What's your view on that?
I think we are too small. I do worry about it. It's not so much whether you spend to 2% or 2.5 or 3%, but it's how you spend. It's the quality of your spend, but also you need certain capabilities. And we still need to be able to potentially field a division, and we still need redundancy in the system, because as we've seen from major conventional wars, you can lose kit very quickly. And we have no redundancy in the system in terms of personnel, and clearly we wouldn't want to lose anybody in a war. But in war, soldiers and armed forces people die. There's no redundancy in the system with kit, and there isn't enough of a reserve. So I do worry. We live in increasingly dangerous times, and we need to be ready to play our part, especially because we are one of the cornerstone nations in NATO. And if we haven't got that spine of that defence capability, then the Northern Expeditionary, our Scandinavian and Northern European partners and our Baltic partners, we need to be supporting them, and we need to show that leadership role that historically we have.
Yeah, so in your view, there does need to be more of an increase in defence spending.
I get the huge pressures, because we've been discussing that today, the huge pressures that we have on expenditure when it comes to supporting families, the NHS, etc. But fundamentally, if you get defence wrong, you pay, and we did it in World War I and World War II, you pay an extraordinary cost in terms of human life and money.
Yeah, Stella, Labour's...
I mean, again, we've seen this government... I want to be lectured by Bob about being tight with money, but I look at what this government's done on procurement when it comes to the armed forces. I look at the investment that we've made in learning the lessons about being more agile, in learning the issues about Intel Core and where we need to go and the kind of force that we need to have. So you and I would agree that we need to look again at what we're doing, because it's a different type of warfare that you might face, and what we've seen over the last couple of years, and it's very clear. But fundamentally, our ability as a country to spend well in defence is not one that you can defend, Bob. And I think that's one of the challenges for all of us. We look at some of the procurement and just think that is where money has leached out the system that could be spent on sorting out our armed forces, supporting them, making sure they have the equipment that they need. We won't talk about the concept of redundancy. I think people listening would find that quite worrying in terms of what you mean by that. But I think we both agree that our armed forces have to meet the challenge of the year. And also the other thing I would say is we have to be able to work with other countries. We have to be able to work what we've seen. I'm chair of the Labour Movement for Europe. If I didn't sit here and say we need to be able to talk to our neighbours about our security, be able to work with the Germans, the French, we need to be able to do that in a way that we've trashed those relationships and our ability.
All right, I'm afraid we're going to go into the chamber now to see PMQs.
Today we'll see the second reading of the Holocaust Memorial Bill. For decades, survivors like the late Sir Ben Helfgott showed the extraordinary courage to share their testimonies so that we would never forget. I hope the whole House will unite today to get this memorial built and put those testimonies at the heart of our democracy for generations to come. Mr. Speaker, this morning I had meetings with ministerial colleagues and others. In addition to my duties in this House, I shall have further such meetings later today.
Dr. Lucan.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And for 3 years since I've been elected, I've been campaigning to improve health facilities in my community. And I'm pleased to see significant investment in Leicestershire with £14 million for a CDC in Hinckley and part of £20 billion for hospital improvements for the LRI and Glenfield. But I'm looking for a hat-trick of health in Hinckley. And what I'm looking for is a day case unit. The money is already there. It's tied up in red tape. I've raised this with the Health Secretary. Would the Prime Minister look to see what he can do? And would he come and like to open the CDC next year in Hinckley?
Prime Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I'm delighted that since its opening last month, the Hinckley CDC has already delivered, I believe, over 300 additional tests to the local community. My honourable friend will know that it's for the local health authorities to determine how to allocate the NHS budget in their area, but I have no doubt that he will continue to make the case for them for a day case unit in his community.
We now come to Leader of the Opposition, Keir Starmer.
Mr. Speaker, can I join your tribute to John and wish him all the best on behalf of the House, and join the Prime Minister in his comments about the Holocaust Memorial. I'd also like to wish Muslims across the country a happy Eid. And Mr. Speaker, last week the Labour Party lost Margaret McDonough, our first female General Secretary, and a trailblazer in every sense of the word. Margaret provided guidance, leadership and loyal friendship to so many in the Labour movement. And it wasn't long after I started in this job that Margaret was at my door, and I will be forever grateful for the advice and support that she gave me. We will all miss her terribly. Yeah. Mr. Speaker, his party spent thousands of pounds on adverts attacking plans to build 300,000 new homes a year. At the same time, his housing minister says it's Tory party policy to build 300,000 new homes a year. So is he for building 300,000 new homes a year or against it?
Prime Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I can just remind the honourable gentleman of our record since being in office. 2.2 2.2 million additional homes, Mr. Speaker. Housing starts double the number we inherited from the Labour Party. More homes meeting the decent home standards. Housing supply up 10% in the last year that we have figures for. And in the last year we had figures for, we also saw a 20-year high in the number of first-time buyers, Mr. Speaker. That's a Conservative government delivering for this country.
Mr. Speaker, it wasn't a difficult question. Can he point to a single person in housing, in construction, anywhere, who thinks he'll actually hit his target of 300,000 new homes a year? Anyone?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, the record is that in the last 3 years, we've delivered almost record numbers of new home building in every one of those years. But Mr. Speaker, it talks about targets, so let's be clear. I promised to put local people in control of new housing. I delivered on that policy within weeks of becoming Prime Minister. But I am confused from the honourable gentleman, because first, the Shadow Community and Housing Secretary said communities should have control. But then he said we should get the targets back and disempower local people. I do want to give him some advice. I don't think it's local people that are the problem. It's a Labour Party policy.
Mr. Speaker, presumably if he could have identified a single person who thought he'd hit his target, he would have told us. And there you have the problem. 1 minute he says he's for building new houses, the next he's campaigning against them. And the truth is, far from delivering, since he crumbled to his backbenchers and scrapped mandatory targets, house building has collapsed. He knows it, they know it, and every expert is telling them it. Why didn't he just admit it? He's not going to get anywhere near his target, is he?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, the honourable gentleman now claims that he supports house building, especially on the green belt. But unfortunately for him, it's good that he agrees that he does believe that now. But unfortunately for him, the Shadow Deputy Prime Minister, the Shadow Minister for Women, the Shadow Health, Justice, Defence, Business, Northern Ireland and Scotland ministers are all united against more house building in their areas, Mr. Speaker. I have to say to them, though, Mr. Speaker, I would say to them, though, they don't have to worry too much because he's never actually kept a promise he's made.
Mr. Speaker, you can tell from his answer, non-answer, and his body language, he's actually given up. He's given up. And his failure isn't just shattering the dream of those who desperately want to own their own home, it's also hitting those who already have a mortgage. Because of their economic chaos, mortgage holders will be £2,900 a year poorer. How can they ever look the British people in the eye again and claim to be the party of home ownership?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I don't think he's noticed that his Shadow Housing Secretary doesn't actually agree with his new policy of concreting over the green belt, Mr. Speaker. She's been campaigning against developments in her own constituency. She said she wanted to prevent urban sprawl and provide green space for local people. I think that's quite sensible, but it's classic Labour, Mr. Speaker, saying one thing here, doing another thing elsewhere. You simply can't trust a word they say.
At least he isn't claiming they are the party of home ownership anymore, because we are. Mr. Speaker, he's given up. Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister says he's 100% on it. But his definition of 100% on it is to gently ask the banks to do the right thing. His softly approach, refusing to put mandatory measures in place, risks leaving 1 million households without support. How many will have to lose their homes before he'll stand up for the people his party have pushed into economic misery?
Mr. Speaker, in fact, the vast majority of the mortgage market is now covered by the new mortgage charter that the Chancellor's brought in. That is delivering practical help to mortgage holders, allowing them to extend their terms, switch to interest-only mortgage, and actually saving them hundreds of pounds a month. So instead of scaring them, actually, there is now practical support in place. But it's right that he raised home ownership, Mr. Speaker. That's why we, on this side of the House, introduced a 95% mortgage guarantee scheme. It's why we introduced the first homes and shared ownership schemes to get people onto the housing ladder. And crucially, Mr. Speaker, it's why we cut stamp duty. So now what we've seen is the highest number of first-time buyers in 20 years, Mr. Speaker. That is twice the number that the Labour Party ever managed.
Mr. Speaker, it's sort of housing crisis. What crisis with this Prime Minister? He must be the only person in the country who thinks that enough houses have been built in the last 13 years. And whether it's those dreaming of getting the keys to their first home or those already with mortgages, the ambitions of families across the country have been crushed by his failing Tory government. House building at its lowest rate since the war because he can't stand up to his own party. A Tory mortgage bombshell because they crashed the economy. Millions left without support because he won't make lenders put families first. Rather than lecturing the rest of the country on holding their nerve, why doesn't he try and locate his?
Well, Mr. Speaker, as always, he hasn't actually taken the time to understand the detail of what we're doing. So, again, I'm happy to explain it again, Mr. Speaker, because it's right that we provide support for mortgage owners, which is why we improve the generosity of the support for mortgage interest scheme. It's why we've introduced a new mortgage charter, which, by the way, goes much more farther than the Labour Party policy on protecting mortgage holders does. On house building, we're proud to protect the green belt and invest millions more in developing brownfield sites. But, Mr. Speaker, the simple truth is, that's what I said I would do, and that's what we've delivered, and that is the difference between us. I deliver what I promise, he just breaks his.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Labour-run Kirklees Council's local plan is seeing hundreds of homes built on greenfield sites, but the agreed developer levies, the Section 106 agreements, which are supposedly for local infrastructure spending, seem to be disappearing into a black hole. So does the Prime Minister agree with me that agreed infrastructure levies from developers shouldn't be going into a general slush fund? They should be spent on local roads, local schools and local health services for the communities impacted by those developments.
My honourable friend raises an excellent point, and that's why the government is reforming the Section 106 payment system to ensure that new development is matched by new infrastructure, because the current system sees far too little of the developers' profits going to build new schools, hospitals or transport infrastructure. It's also too slow and plagued by uncertainties, and that particularly hampers smaller local developers. So it will be replaced by a new non-negotiable, local determined infrastructure levy, which will deliver exactly what the honourable gentleman and others want to see: investment in local communities.
SNP leader Stephen Flynn.
Mr. Speaker, I wish to start by paying tribute to SNP legend Winnie Ewan and Scotland men's national team former manager Craig Brown, who both so sadly passed in recent days, and to all Muslims who are celebrating Eid Mubarak. Mr. Speaker, on Sunday the Prime Minister patronised the public when he told them that in the face of ever-increasing mortgage bills that they simply need to hold their nerve. What a nerve. So may I ask him, the near billionaire, when was the last time that he struggled to pay a bill?
Mr. Speaker, the reason that mortgage rates are rising is because of inflation, Mr. Speaker. That is the root cause, which is why it's absolutely the right policy to tackle, halve inflation and reduce it back to target. Now, that does mean that we do have to make difficult decisions. It does mean we have to be patient while the impact of those decisions actually has an impact. But in the meantime, Mr. Speaker, as I was explaining previously, we are taking practical steps to support mortgage holders across the United Kingdom, particularly through the SMI scheme and the new mortgage charter.
Stephen Flynn.
Mr. Speaker, that answer confirms what we already know, that this Prime Minister is out of touch and the Tory party is soon to be out of time. And what the public really want is change. But in a week where the Conservative Party and indeed the Labour Party both refuse to accept proposals for public sector pay rises, whilst at the same time accepting the economic damage of Brexit? Is it not the case that Westminster does not offer the people real change nor real hope for the future?
Prime Minister. Well, Mr. Speaker, the honourable gentleman just exposes the complete economic illiteracy of the SNP's position. His first question talks about the challenges posed on ordinary families by higher interest rates caused by higher inflation. What does his next question do? Support a policy that would increase government borrowing and make the situation worse. Mr. Speaker, it just demonstrates completely candidly why the SNP's approach to economic management is simply not fit for anyone in the United Kingdom.
Mr. Speaker, local police stations are a key part of communities such as Aldridge in my constituency, and that's why I continue to make the case to Labour's Police and Crime Commissioner to save and strengthen the role of Aldridge Police Station, not force it to close. So does the Prime Minister agree with me that any such closure would be reckless, and Police and Crime Commissioners should be working with local communities and local police teams to provide greater certainty, particularly given the extra 1,376 extra police officers this government has put into the West Midlands?
Prime Minister. Mr. Speaker, I'm pleased to hear about the extra police officers that the government has funded in my right honourable friend's community, but I am concerned to hear about the planned closure of Aldridge Police Station. I'd like to thank my right honourable friend for raising such an important issue. I know it's one on which she is championing her constituents. As she will know, unfortunately, this is a decision of the locally elected Labour Police and Crime Commissioner, and I would join her in urging them to think again.
Liz Savile-Roberts.
The Prime Minister's solution to inflation is to push families into poverty while letting corporate profits pile up. Absolutely. Economic illiteracy. The IMF said this week that the way to cut inflation is for companies to cut their profit margins. It's corporate greed fueling inflation, not workers' need for fair pay. Can he explain to the 1 in 5 people in Wales facing hunger because they cannot afford to buy decent food why they must pay his price for lowering inflation?
Prime Minister. Mr. Speaker, actually, my honourable friend the Chancellor met with all the economic regulators this morning, and they'll be making an announcement later about their plans to ensure fairness of pricing and supply chain to ease the burden on consumers. But I'm glad she brought up the IMF when it comes to tackling inflation, because actually the IMF, in their words, strongly endorsed our plan to halve inflation, and they called our steps both decisive and responsible.
Jonathan Lord.
Mr. Speaker, as my right honourable friend knows, I've been liaising closely with the Department for Levelling Up Housing and Communities and with the Treasury with regard to the terrible news of Woking Council's recent Section 114 notice. Would my right honourable friend agree with me that in this scenario, the vulnerable must be protected and that the local councillors of all parties need to work together to try to put the council's finances back on the right track?
Prime Minister. I know my honourable friend is a great champion for his Woking residents, and as he knows, the Secretary of State for Levelling Up has intervened in this authority and appointed commissioners to ensure that decisions are taken that provide the best outcomes for residents, including the most vulnerable and indeed the public purse. I agree with him that local councillors should be working together with the commissioners to put the council's finances in order. The commissioners will submit their first report to the Secretary of State, setting out progress on the council's path to improvement and financial sustainability, and I look forward with him to seeing further progress.
Sir Christopher Bryant.
Thank you. The Prime Minister has had responsibility for the UK economy now for 1,323 days, and he's delivered. He's delivered the largest national peacetime debt ever, the largest tax burden since the Second World War, the highest core inflation since 1991, the fastest interest rate rises since 1989, and the biggest fall in living standards in our history. So will he stop lecturing my constituents about holding their nerve, ditch the lame excuses, and admit that he is literally the worst person to be leading this country through a cost of living crisis?
Mr. Speaker, Mr. Speaker, again, what do we hear from the party opposite? only ideas that would make the situation far worse, Mr. Speaker. It's as simple as that. The honourable gentleman has sat there and supported plans to borrow tens of billions of pounds more. That would make inflation worse. The honourable gentleman has sat there and said that we should not stand up to unaffordable union pay demands. That would make the situation worse. And the honourable gentleman has sat there and supported plans to not exploit our domestic sources of energy, Mr. Speaker, imperiling our energy security. Those are all things that would make not just the situation worse for British families today, but for years into the future, and that's why this Conservative government will keep doing the right thing to support them.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My constituents rely on many nearby hospitals. Milton Keynes, where this government has committed to a new women and children's hospital. Stoke Mandeville, who has just completed the build of a new children's A&E. But also Wickham, where infrastructure and maintenance issues in the ageing tower is preventing around 2,000 operations a year from going ahead. My local trust has a plan for a £200 million new clinical centre at Wickham Hospital. Will my right honourable friend, the Prime Minister, work with myself and Buckinghamshire colleagues to make that a reality?
Prime Minister. Well, I thank my honourable friend for his question. Whilst he knows that we are no longer inviting further schemes to join the new hospital programme, I can tell him that in the future new schemes will be considered through the rolling programme of capital investment in hospital infrastructure. That will secure the building of new hospitals beyond 2030 and mean future investment to upgrade the NHS estate across the country. Now, future plans for that will obviously be set out in spending reviews and fiscal events, but in the meantime, I know that he will continue to make the passioned case for Wickham Hospital, and I join him in that.
Chris Elm.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Hundreds of steel workers are outside Parliament today, and some are in the gallery, calling on the Prime Minister to act now to back our vital steel industry before it is too late. So will he confirm today that he will match the ambition of the Labour Party and our international competitors to deliver competitive energy prices, invest in green steel production, use UK steel in our procurement systems, and protect us from dirty steel imports by introducing climate measures? And when will he get on with protecting and supporting the industry?
Mr. Speaker, we're proud to support the steel industry and value the contribution that it makes to this country, which is why we've put in place the Energy Intensive Industry Scheme that provides hundreds of millions of pounds of support to steel companies with their energy bills. We've also introduced the Industrial Energy Transformation Fund so that companies can apply for capital grants to help them with the transition. We are taking forward plans in the Treasury for carbon border adjustment mechanisms to ensure a level playing field, and it's why, Mr. Speaker, during the pandemic, that I stepped in to support financially a steel company in Wales.
Sir James Duddridge.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Despite 5 years of lobbying, sadly the Commonwealth Parliamentary Association International branch will leave the United Kingdom. Mr. Speaker, you know this is a great concern to the House, although perhaps something a little niche for our constituents. It is important. They need special status. The government haven't granted that by way of a short bill or an amendment to an existing bill. And could the Prime Minister at this late stage, this month, do something about this? Because otherwise they'll be gone, never to come back.
Prime Minister. Well, Mr. Speaker, the United Kingdom values the work of the Commonwealth Parliamentary Association. My right honourable friend, the Foreign Secretary, has made clear that he does not want the CPA International to relocate. He's written to them in March to confirm that officials from the FCDO would work with the CPA to find a mutually acceptable solution to the status issue, and I look forward to seeing progress.
Alison McGovern.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, your constituents and mine, I think, have been made a promise by the Prime Minister. Inflation at or below 5% by the end of this year. So I want to ask the Prime Minister, what will happen if he fails to meet that promise? Will it be yet more ranting on about the Labour Party, or will it be the general election my constituents crave?
No, Mr. Speaker, we are sticking to the course of bringing inflation down, Mr. Speaker. I think what the Labour Party need to understand is that requires making difficult and tough decisions, Mr. Speaker. It requires prioritising. It requires being able to say no when people come asking you to borrow more money. Those are the type of responsible decisions that I will make and the Conservative government will make because they're the right ones for the country.
David Moore.
Speaker. For over 160 years, Southport Pier has been at the centre of our visitor economy, welcoming visitors from far and wide, including Chorley, Mr. Speaker. It stood the tests of time, except for the mismanagement of Labour-controlled Sefton Council, who've closed our pier. Businesses are concerned it will have a huge impact on tourism. Will the Prime Minister condemn these actions and support my campaign and efforts to work with this Conservative government to get our pier open?
Prime Minister. Well, Mr. Speaker, can I welcome my honourable friend's commitment to the important community assets in his constituency, such as the historic Grade 2 listed Southport Pier. And I am pleased to say that he is working and succeeded in getting the government to provide £2 million as part of the Coastal Community Fund to undertake improvements in the pier. And that's alongside the landmark £35.5 million town deal for Southport, which is the second largest town deal anywhere in the country.
Samantha Dixon.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This is the first opportunity that I've had to put a question to the Prime Minister for the residents of the City of Chester. So, why does the Prime Minister think it's acceptable for sewage to be pumped into the beautiful River Dee that flows through Chester for the next 27 years?
Mr. Speaker, of course it's not acceptable, and that's why this government has gone further than any other government in tackling this issue, committing to monitor 100% of storm overflows, an investment programme of £56 billion to upgrade infrastructure, and enshrining in law strict targets, as well as introducing unlimited fines for water companies. But when it came to talking about those policies in this House, the party opposite couldn't even be bothered to turn up and vote for them.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Later today, Parliament will welcome apprentices from around the UK who were working in the aerospace industry. And I'm very much looking forward to meeting Callum and Brittany, who are both apprentices in my constituency of Wolverhampton North East at Collins Aerospace. Would he join me in celebrating apprenticeships in the aerospace industry and encourage colleagues to attend and meet their apprentices?
Well, can I join with my honourable friend in both celebrating everyone doing an apprentice and encourage everyone to go and meet theirs later on today and pay tribute to Callum and Brittany in particular. And she's absolutely right to highlight the importance of the aerospace industry, particularly because of our new defence cooperation agreement with Italy and Japan to build a new generation of fighter aircraft. Thousands of new jobs will be created across the country. Many of those will be through apprentices, and that's an example of this Conservative government providing opportunities for the next generation.
Ian Mans.
Mr. Speaker, Prime Minister, last year 1.7 million children missed more than 10% of their schooling. 125,000 children were absent more than they were in school, and a further 140,000 children were missing from formal schooling completely. This is both a safeguarding and an educational catastrophe, and it's happening on the Prime Minister's watch. Yesterday, the Schools Minister told the Education Select Committee that primary legislation was required to initiate a national register for children missing from education so we can find out where they are. Will the Prime Minister commit to bringing forward necessary legislation to combat this crisis for our children as a matter of urgency?
Prime Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I agree with the honourable gentleman that children missing school is a tragedy and it's incredibly damaging for educational outcomes, which is why during the pandemic and afterwards we invested £5 billion to help children catch up with lost learning. It's important that we continue to deliver on those plans, and we will of course make sure that we work with the sector to have more children attending school more often.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Economic recovery and reconstruction will be vitally important to Ukraine when it comes to rebuilding a free and sovereign nation. So will my right honourable friend help galvanise the expertise of our UK's private sector to help strengthen Ukraine's recovery and their economic prospects after this devastating war?
Prime Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, time and time again, Ukraine has shown its ability to rapidly harness innovation and creativity, and I know that its economic recovery will be no different. And my right honourable friend is absolutely right to highlight that private sector expertise and investment will be critical to that recovery. And I was pleased that over 400 world-leading companies pledged to back Ukraine's reconstruction at the very successful recovery conference that the UK hosted the other week. We're doing our part as well, Mr. Speaker, with a $3 billion World Bank loan guarantee on top of all the other investment that we've put in place. And I think what the conference showed is that there's enormous momentum across the world to support Ukraine's recovery, and that recovery and ambition is being led by the United Kingdom.
Charlotte David.
Mr. Speaker, a university student in Lower Chemise has seen her rent rise by £200 a month due to the mortgage rate increases. She is now at risk of homelessness and she can't return to the family home. She has no choice but to use food banks, even though she has 2 part-time jobs. Not only is she falling behind in her studies, she's falling further into debt and she's falling into depression. What does the Prime Minister say to constituents like mine who are paying the dual price of this government's cost of living crisis and mortgage rates crisis?
Well, Mr. Speaker, we've taken significant action to help families across the country, most notably by taxing the windfall profits of energy companies and using that money to pay around half of a typical family, including all of her constituents' energy bills. That support is worth £1,500, Mr. Speaker, and I'm pleased that energy bills are forecast to fall £430 when the price cap resets in a couple of days. But beyond that, there's considerable support for the most vulnerable in our society, including £900 of cost of living payments for those on universal credit and additional support for pensioners and indeed disabled people, Mr. Speaker, and that's what we'll continue to do.
Bailey.
Speaker, we are heading into the 5th week of Sandwell Labour's refuse strikes. We've had flying pickets, we've had reports of the GMB blocking ambulance workers getting out of their depot as a result of their picket lines, and the PCC trying to encourage the police not to police it. Can I ask my right honourable friend to ensure that he convenes a meeting urgently so we can resolve this, and perhaps he'll join me and tell Labour politicians, particularly one in particular, grow a spine and put people before your paymasters.
We've done very well, don't spoil it now, Prime Minister.
Well, my honourable friend put it very well, but illustrated exactly the issue. Because, Mr. Speaker, the Labour Party is unable to stand up to its union paymasters and back our plans to introduce minimum service and safety levels in critical industries. That's the type of practical action that supports working families. It's one that the Labour Party isn't strong enough to actually support.
Welcome back, Donald.
I'm grateful, Mr. Speaker. After events in Russia at the weekend, it is unclear what the future holds for the Wagner Group. But what can never be washed away is the catalogue of crimes they've committed across Africa, the Middle East and, of course, in Ukraine. But despite all of that, Mr. Speaker, the government doesn't yet have a permanent Cabinet Office official to coordinate all of the organs of government to pursue the criminals in the Wagner Group. Will he appoint one? And crucially, will he fund collecting evidence of Wagner Group war crimes that have been committed across the world so that these criminals, no matter what happens, can be brought to justice in future?
Well, Mr. Speaker, we have consistently condemned the Wagner Group and we carefully monitor their actions in Ukraine and the wider world, as the Honourable gentleman mentions. We have designated both the Wagner Group and its leader under our sanctions regime already, and we also support international mechanisms which hold individual mercenaries in the Wagner Group to account for violations of international law. But I also reassure him that we are working very closely with our partners to counter the malign use of such proxies by Russia and more generally across the continent.
Paul Bristow.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. On Monday night, an illegal traveller encampment was established on Bretton Park. On Saturday, the much-loved Bretton Festival is due to take place on Bretton Park. This House passed legislation that gives more powers to police to tackle these illegal encampments. Will the Prime Minister make it clear today from the dispatch box that he expects police to use those powers on these encampments that blight public spaces and public parks in places like Peterborough?
Well, Mr. Speaker, we absolutely recognise the misery that unauthorised encampments can cause to local communities. And that's why we've delivered on our manifesto commitment to give police the powers they need to tackle those people on unauthorised encampments who are causing harm. Now, of course, how the police use these powers is an operational matter for chief constables, but we wouldn't have legislated for them if we didn't expect them to use them, Mr. Speaker. And I am told that Home Office officials are liaising regularly with the National Police Chiefs Council on this exact matter.
Final question, Martin Docker to use.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In the past couple of days, yet again, we have been reminded that a member of the other House was appointed contrary to the recommendations of MI5. And in the Channel 4 film, that even the monarch was actually asked to be involved because Whitehall officials were so opposed, given that they were deemed a security risk to the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland. So can I ask the Prime Minister, does he agree with MI5 or with his predecessor that peer should still be in the other House?
Prime Minister.
If Mr. Speaker, for obvious reasons, I'll talk in more general terms. With the House of Lords Appointment Commission vets crossbench and party political life peerage nominations to the House of Lords, and where appropriate, seeks advice from government departments and agencies. And were a Prime Minister to recommend a peerage against the Commission's formal advice, the House of Lords Appointment Commission has previously undertaken that it would write publicly to the relevant Parliamentary Select Committee.
Completes Prime Minister's questions.
On house building, criticising the government's record and the drop of targets, which it said had led to the lowest rate of house building since World War II. The PM, of course, pushing back, saying, criticising Labour for their plans, in his words, to concrete over the green belt. Nick, what do you think we learnt from those exchanges?
It's the second week in a row where Keir Starmer has directly gone for the Conservative record on house building and the economy. And I think both are actually quite difficult for Rishi Sunak. One on house building because there's that fundamental tension in the Conservative Party between the MPs who want to build loads and those who don't want to build much at all. But the thing that makes a lot of Tory MPs really nervous just now is those interest rates going up. It's the idea that traditional Conservative voters are facing a bit of a hit to their pocket. And it felt like in PMQs there that the PM's comments at the weekend to Laura Kuenssberg about holding our nerve didn't go down particularly well. The one thing, though, that I think was difficult for Keir Starmer, he talks about doing more when it comes to helping people with their mortgages and with higher interest payments. His policies, or what Labour want the banks to do, is actually very similar.
Doesn't sound too dissimilar. One thing I picked up on, the Keir Starmer said, we are the party of home ownership. That's something they're going to potentially
mantle they want to try and take.
Yeah, absolutely. Johnny, the government has seemingly caved to its backbenchers on housing targets.
It's not a question of caving. I mean, you can dress it up as an argument in the Conservative Party if you want, but the reality is in the country there is this tension between people who want to build houses and people who want to live in a town or a city where there are green belts. So, look, there aren't simplistic answers in this space. You know, as the Prime Minister said, you know, the highest amount of new homeowners in 20 years, right? So he has got a good record on that. But I think, you know, it's accepted across the pitch that each government over many years has not built enough houses. And there is that tension that we have to be realistic about. But at the same time, you know, if we are going to tackle the housing crisis, we do need to build more. And, you know, the Prime Minister accepts that. And he's got a good record when it comes to first-time buyers.
Annalise.
Well, unfortunately, the Prime Minister's had a catastrophic record, actually. We've now got the lowest rates of house building since the Second World War in our country. And I'm afraid that is a direct result of decisions that Rishi Sunak has made, it seems, under pressure from within his party. Because actually, when you ask the public whether they want to see homes built in the right places that are genuinely affordable, they're in favour of that. You know, Rishi Sunak decided he was going to scrap targets for housing delivery. Very, very soon after that, you got the house builders saying this is going to push down house building. And surprise, surprise, that's what's happened. And there is a big difference here with Labour. You know, we know these issues are not easy issues, but if we're going to get our economy back on track, have the highest rate of economic growth in the G7 sustainably, if we're going to provide the right homes for people in the places where they need to be and they're going to be affordable, that means saying we will have targets, ones that are actually agreed with local areas, but we will have actually targets there because you need to take those big decisions when you're going to govern in the interest of the British people.
OK, in the interests of the British people, apparently we didn't have sound at the beginning, so I'm going to reintroduce our guests. We have Johnny Mercer, who's, of course, the Veterans Minister, and Annalise Dodds for the Labour Party, who is also, she's chair, but also shadow Women and Equalities as well. So there you go, you've both now been officially introduced, and people heard that. One of the things you said, Annalise, which is interesting, which is you said build in the right places. And of course, as Johnny said, that's the sticking point, isn't it? Because people have very different views about what is the right place and the green belt. And I just want to show our audience at home some tweets. This highlights the difficulty that perhaps all the political parties are in. We look at this tweet from the Labour Party a few years ago. The Conservatives Developers Charter would sell off and sell out our communities. Local people, not Tory party donors, should decide what's best for where they live. Contrast that with a tweet, a much more recent tweet from the Labour Party, which says the hopes of a generation are being blocked by those who more often than not enjoy the secure homes and jobs that they're denying to others. So we see here, don't we? This is the core of the argument.
No, because actually it's perfectly clear what Labour wants to see. And I think the Prime Minister just highlighted, I'm afraid, his ignorance of the real situation when he was talking about the green belt in his answers. The reality with the green belt is those regulations, you know this, Johnny, we all know this as MPs.
The reality, are diametrically opposed, right? And this is from the Labour Party who've got. Please do finish your point.
So you're trying to talk over me because you know what I'm going to say. The green belt legislation that was set up many, many years ago, we see at the moment classified as green belt disused petrol stations, disused car parks, right? We've got in Tottenham, I believe, a disused petrol station which could not have affordable homes put on it because it's classified as green belt. That is a joke.
Does that tweet still stand? The first one we showed people.
Absolutely.
Is that still stands for the Labour Party?
Absolutely. That's why we say we need to have those locally driven targets. And actually, when you talk with people in different areas, they recognise there's a problem with housing. The Conservatives are trying to dress up this failure in delivery of new homes by saying that this is all to do with the green belt. They've failed to update that green belt legislation. It means we're not building on those disused car parks, on those disused...
Annalise, will we have targets back? Will targets come back under a Labour government?
I just said a moment ago, yes, they will. They will be decided with local areas. Now, the Conservatives don't want that. Obviously, Rishi Sunak backed down on that under pressure from his own party. But it's not in the interests of those who desperately need housing in our country.
I mean, this is classic Keir Starmer Labour Party, right? You have two diametrically opposite views there, right? That you're trying to kid people. Hang on, I'll let you speak, right? Trying to kid people that they're too stupid to understand the nuances between them. The reality is, no one has the first idea what Labour thinks on this because they say the first thing that comes into their head, they see the tide going one way on the green belt, they say one thing, the tide goes the other way, they say another thing. It's really feeble politics, right? These are really difficult decisions around house building, and it's completely normal to A, want to build more houses, and B, want to protect your green spaces. And that's exactly what the balance that Rishi is trying to...
Hang on. You just pushed on the number this, if I may, because the green belt legislation at the moment is not actually promoting those green spaces. And surely you'd agree with that. No, we don't.
You don't?
Because of what I just said.
Can I not read?
Yes, but I think if you read it, you would recognise...
two diametrically opposite
because
positions.
it talked about green spaces, not green belt. You just muddled them up. The point is
those tweets are really clear, right? And on one side, they're hammering home builders. On the other side, they're saying we need to love home builders, right?
No,
the British people aren't stupid, Annalise. I think this is bad news.
And I'm not going to say that you are, but I think you're trying to twist things, Johnny.
They understand the nuance of this debate, right? You say one thing to one group of people, one thing to another, depending on which way the tide's going, and you make up your position.
Absolutely not. We've been consistent.
That is the big problem with the Labour Party. No one's got any idea.
The big difference is we listen to what the British people are saying to us. They're saying that housing is far too expensive, the cost of it pushed up under the Conservatives. They're saying that they need that new housing. And we're saying we will have targets. You know, we're not shilly-shallying around this. We've said we will have targets. We will decide them with local areas and we'll deliver on them. And we're listening to the British people. We're not listening to our Conservative councillors and Conservative members, which is what Rishi Sunak has been driven by.
Give it a year, they'll change that policy.
Oh, nice.
The fundamental tension, apart from green space versus green belt, is that people want to. A lot of people want to stop things being built in their back garden, but the government wants a big national target and a big national plan. And my question is, what do you do when a local area turns around and says, actually, we don't want that high a target? Are you going to force them to do it, or are you just going to accept we won't build there?
Johnny, this is a real world issue. You know.
Yeah, but this is the crux of the issue, right? Is that people understand, everybody in this country knows you need to build more houses, right? But we want to protect our green spaces and our green belt land. Accepting, Annalise, those are two different things, right? It's not fair to then say, right, we're going to have these top-down targets and go out, and whether you like it or not in a local community, you're going to have those. It's got nothing to do with managing the politics of the Conservative Party. It's got everything to do with managing the politics of the country, which is what the Conservative Party is actually about, in trying to balance this very, very difficult balance.
OK, Annalise.
Well, I'm afraid what you've done by getting rid of that support for extra house building, what you've done is push those levels of house building to their lowest since World War II. That has massively put the cost up for people. And actually, in terms of that question, the way you do it is you have those locally decided plans. Now, that does mean sometimes difficult decisions within local areas. You know, I've been clear, for example, in my area, that we do need to have new housing, that it's got to be the right housing in the right place. We're actually being countermanded by government on this, saying that, for example, we can't have targets we want to have around affordability with some of our developments. So it's clear whose side I'm afraid they've been on around this. Labour does want to reflect those local concerns ultimately and build those homes, because the failure to do that is holding our economy back.
Yeah, and the Leader of the Opposition did move on to the cost of housing, and the cost of living is, of course, something that's on everyone's minds at the moment. The Chancellor was meeting with regulators earlier this morning, wasn't he? Because we were discussing earlier in the programme about the chances of water bills, for instance, going up by 40% next year to try and make repairs to sewage. Have we heard, did anything come out of that meeting with regulators?
Not yet, and my hunch, although the Prime Minister did suggest something was coming, my hunch is there won't be anything particularly new from it. The government's policy at the moment, or its approach, seems to be to try and put pressure on the regulators and the banks to think a bit more.
It's kind of moral pressure, isn't it?
Exactly, and crucially, it's not new government policy at the moment. It's about saying to the regulators, use the rules or the powers you have at the moment as expansively as you can to try and help.
And on a practical level, Johnny, that's not really helping most people, is it?
Look, I mean, the debate around sewage, it was a fantastic moment for that MP to clip themselves up on social media about piling sewage into the sea. The whole thing is a complete attempt to hoodwink the public, right? No one wants to see sewage in the sea. The reality is that now we have monitors on them and we know what's going to the sea, and there's a system through the regulator to try and bring that down and to make it better. If you're going to change that overnight, you're going to see water bills go up by sort of 50%, right, which people are not going to be able to afford.
Annalise.
I believe actually she was talking about a river, but anyway, never mind. The point is that there are not monitors on loads of these sewage outflows. There's a huge gap in monitoring. The government said it was going to sort this out. The Prime Minister now says he's going to try and get there. Well, well done him. I mean, we've been waiting years for this. So we don't have the monitors that were promised by the Conservative government. And we don't have the accountability. You know, Labour called for a vote in Parliament on whether directors of companies should actually have some accountability around this. Of course, the Conservatives voted against that, as well as against our other measures to protect consumers in this area. So this is a frustration.
What about that argument? What about that argument, Johnny, that we're seeing some of these big companies paying out huge dividends, and then they're saying, "Oh, but we want to repair the sewage system, so you're going to pay for it."
Yeah, look, I went to visit South West Water in my constituency to have exactly that conversation, because to your average person, right, the contrast of paying out these share dividends versus sewage still going to the sea is a really unpleasant contrast, and makes everyone feel uncomfortable. The truth is they have to raise their money, right, in order to invest in the system, and they have to provide some sort of returns. And if they don't provide returns to investors, they're not going to get the money, and you're not going to be able to rebuild the system, and you're not going to be able to stop sewage going into the sea. So the reality is the system has been inherited by us. It's been the situation in this country for many years. Obviously, Labour don't really, they don't believe in anything, right? So this is the latest thing that they can actually campaign on around sewage. sewage. No one wants to see sewage in the sea, right? It's ridiculous that anyone would. And this government's actually doing something about it. You saw the Prime Minister talking about 100% of outlets being monitored. It's actually doing something about it, rather than just standing up, sound bites. Let's treat everyone like their sewage. Don't pump water and sewage into the sea. I mean, it's just kind of really feeble politics, and we need to grow up a bit.
I'm sorry, Johnny, I just talked about a clear policy difference between Labour and the Conservatives. And Labour... OK, I'll say it again, quickly, because I don't want it to get boring for viewers. I said that Labour would actually make directors...
Not be boring for viewers.
Well, I said that Labour would actually make directors accountable for these spills.
They are accountable.
Right, well...
They are accountable, aren't they?
Well, they're not,
through their pay
actually.
And remuneration, whether or not they set the companies.
Well,
so they are
I'm
accountable.
terribly
so again,
sorry, Johnny, but the evidence doesn't show that.
And Annalise, what is Labour's policy? Because we had heard, speculation about renationalisation in the past. We were talking about mutualisation earlier. What is Labour's policy?
Well, those practical measures that I just talked about, which Johnny, I'm very sorry they didn't hear them.
Explain them.
Saying that there should be accountability. Well, they're sufficiently real that actually we had the Conservatives criticising them and whipping their MPs not to vote for them. And I know that people up and down the country next to these sewage-filled rivers and next to these sewage-strewn beaches are not happy with that lack of action and suggesting that at the moment companies are accountable to this, that they really care about this. I'm afraid that evidence...
I've been to visit them,
in terms
they do.
Well, so have I, actually.
Okay, and you found they just
happening.
don't care and they just want to turn taps on and pile sewage
at
into the sea.
the local level,
Annalise,
but
this
what
is like
we've
student
seen...
politics, isn't it? They don't do that.
They do care at the local level, but what we see nationally is we've seen a situation where there's been impunity, and I'm afraid you cannot look at the huge increase we've seen in sewage going into our waterways, which has had huge impact on people who want to use those waterways, and no response from government. And I know the Conservatives are under pressure on this. We've seen them ultimately being held to account on this in by-elections, in the local elections, because just local people do not buy this. They can see there's a policy difference there.
Luckily,
and that they're not backing Labour's measures.
OK, all right, well, thanks both. Thanks very much, Nick. I am now going to do a public service announcement. The best place to watch Politics Live is, of course, right here on BBC Two, but you can also watch all our past episodes over the last few weeks on the BBC iPlayer. As you can see, we've had conversations on a range of different stories, and we're also a podcast now on BBC Sounds as well, so you can just get the audio of our recent programmes if you find that more convenient or don't like looking at us. Who knows? We're going to move on now and talk about a story we were discussing earlier. This is the accusation of groping made against one of the Conservative candidates to become London Mayor, Daniel Korski. This accusation was made by the novelist and TV producer Daisy Goodwin. She has accused Mr Korski of a groping incident in 2013 during a meeting at Downing Street. Let's watch a clip of her speaking on the Today programme from earlier this morning.
Yes, it happened to me 10 years ago, but when something like this happens to you, you know that it happens to you because you were there, you felt it, you felt amazed, shocked and rather humiliated.
OK, that was Daisy Goodwin speaking to the Today programme. And I should say we've heard from Mr Korski. He categorically denies those allegations and has said that he has made it clear that he would welcome any investigation and would cooperate fully should one go ahead. We asked this of Bob Seeley earlier. In your view, should there be an investigation?
Look, it would be completely inappropriate for a Cabinet Minister to get involved in this, right? Allegations have been made. Where allegations have been made, of course, they're going to be looked into. I think this, there's a real tendency in Westminster to kind of infantilise this stuff and play into the politics of it. This is a serious, serious issue, and I just think it's really inappropriate to sort of have in the public debate whether this should happen or that should happen. This individual has made serious allegations. Clearly, any allegation is going to get investigated, right? No one sits in Number 10 or in Whitehall, puts their fingers in their ears and pretends this stuff doesn't happen. But it does have to be done in a professional way, not in the public domain.
So there will be an investigation. What is, in fact, the latest, Nick? Can you...
I'll be honest, I don't actually know. We've been asking a lot, and one of the things that I think has come up through this is that it's actually quite hard to make a complaint. So Ms Goodwin, when she was on the Today programme this morning, was saying after she heard various politicians say yesterday there's no formal complaint, she made a formal complaint, or she tried to. Yeah. She phoned Downing Street, couldn't get through to anybody, was told that they couldn't take a message, emailed the Cabinet Office, got an auto reply, and only got an actual person to speak to her after it appeared in the media. So that doesn't feel to me like a system that's working particularly well.
Look, I think to be fair, this is an unprecedented situation where you've got an allegation from a number of years ago under a different administration with people who don't work in that building anymore. So, you know, all I would reiterate
is not about that. It's about whether there's actually a way that you can formally raise a complaint.
Of course there is. We have different grievance processes now, and this has tightened up a number of times over the last few years. This idea that someone's going to make a complaint about anything in Whitehall or in government that happens and no one's going to listen is just for the birds. It's just this is an incredibly difficult and sensitive area, and conversations will be going on how best to deal with it, and it will be dealt with in a fair and professional manner, as it should be.
Annalise.
Well, I have to say that this is an issue that's been a problem across politics. Obviously, we don't know the details of this case, but I think it's really important, actually, that we acknowledge that there has been impunity for sexual harassment. I'm not saying that was the case here, but, you know, in any case, there has been too much impunity in the past. You know, Labour's learned from that, so we have set up a very different system to what we had before within the Labour Party now. So we've got one route in for anyone who says that they've been subject to sexual harassment. We've got independent investigators. We've then got a lot of independent checks through all of that process. We needed to put that into place because we recognised that actually we couldn't say that things would always be dealt with properly. And we didn't want to say, well, actually, we're pretty sure it's going to be all right. We wanted to know that we had the right system there so that there really would be that dedicated support as well for victims. And what you find quite often is that it may be many years actually since something happened. It might be that the individual, you know, quite often they might be actually in a junior position, you know, not necessarily talking, as I say, about any specific case, but they may feel they've advanced in their career to an extent where they can actually raise an issue, and that's when they then need the system to be ready for them. And as I said, Labour has changed our processes a lot to make sure that will be the case.
Yeah. OK, well, just finally then, we are drawing towards the end of the programme. I just want to show people the Daily Telegraph headline here. We did discuss this briefly earlier. Keir Starmer plans to axe Labour chairman in pre-election reshuffle. Labour officials expect leader to demote Annalise Dodds and replace her with a figure more experienced in running campaigns. Almost feel slightly embarrassed saying that, sitting next to you, to be honest. Annalise, what's your reaction to that story in the Telegraph?
Well, I find it pretty amusing. I mean, I'm the chair, not the chairman. I'm the Shadow Secretary of State for Women and Equalities, not as I'm described there. I'm not really very interested in kind of ill-informed, ultimately anonymous tittle-tattle. You know, what I'm interested in is the people's priorities. Yeah. That's what I'm focused on as the chair of the Labour Party.
So are you confident you're going to stay in your post?
Absolutely, but ultimately, you know, always it's Keir Starmer who is the leader. He decides where anybody goes, but I'm really determined that I will... Oh,
don't worry about it. Don't worry. He will change his mind, guarantee.
No, I know that we're a really good and strong team at the moment, and, you know, I chair our National Policy Forum. That's drawing up the policies for the next election. I think we've got that really strong group of people now advocating for Labour, and I'm really, really proud that I'm part of it.
Nick, what's this about floating this kind of thing in the Telegraph?
There has been a lot of speculation about Keir Starmer reshuffles, and when you speak to people in Labour HQ, some of them think he's got to do something before the election to get the right people in the right place, and the time to do that would be probably this year. But there are a good few people around Keir Starmer who think he might not do it at all. So I don't know.
So we could just be stasis.
Suggesting this guy can't make up his mind if we don't know what he believes in. That is headline news.
Well, we did have a discussion earlier in the programme about whether there have been so many changes at the top of the Conservative Party that it's starting to...
There have been a few
changes, I would say on that, I've been Labour Party chair for 2 years. I think I've had 6 Tory Party chairs in that time that I've managed to get rid of.
That sounds like a number.
We like to keep things fresh.
You certainly have in that case.
It certainly is fresh, isn't it? So we'll kind of watch this space. And, well, I don't know. When would we know by, Nick?
So it's a good question. I suppose you could do it right up until next summer if there's going to be an autumn election. But I suppose that the big question Keir Starmer is facing is, has he got his top team around his top table? Does he think that some sort of freshening up is needed? before potentially Labour get into government. I think you'll be weighing that up quite carefully.
Okay, all right. Well, thank you very much. Thanks to all my guests. That's all for today, but I'll be back tomorrow with more Politics Live at 12:15 here on BBC Two and iPlayer.